The party had been my idea. 200 guests, a marquee in the garden, caterers from the place on Hartley Street, where Margaret had always said the salmon was the best in the county. 50 years of marriage deserved something large, something visible, something that announced itself to the world the way our life together had always announced itself, with confidence and good silver and the right burgundy. I had been planning it for 4 months. I had arranged the flowers she loved, white peonies, late for the season, but the florist had found them, and the string quartet for after dinner, and the slideshow of photographs our daughter Rose had spent 3 weekends assembling on her laptop while she came and went from the kitchen asking me what year was that one. And are you sure this is Devon? Dad, you both look so young. I had written a speech that made our son Daniel cry during the rehearsal read, and I had taken his tears as a very good sign. I had organized everything, checked everything, stood at the window of our bedroom that morning, and felt, as the caterers arranged chairs on the lawn in the early July sunshine, the specific satisfaction of a man who has spent 50 years building something and is about to see it celebrated in the way it deserves. The evening was perfect until Margaret took my hand, led me through the French doors and into the garden, and told me she had never loved me. Not, I have fallen out of love with you, which would have been devastating in the ordinary way that such things are devastating. That familiar grief of something worn through. Not, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. The modern formulation people use when they want to soften something that refuses to be softened. What she said was, I never loved you, James. She said it quietly, in the garden where I had proposed to her 51 years ago under the oak tree. We planted together the spring after our wedding as a living mark of the beginning of our living thing. And the oak was enormous now, broad and certain and 40 feet tall. And she stood in its shade and looked at me the way you look at someone you are about to do something irreversible to. And my hands went cold inside hers. I am 72 years old. I have been a professor of English literature for 38 years. I have read more descriptions of grief and shock than most people will encounter in their lifetimes. Have spent 4 decades teaching Hardy and Tolstoy and Lawrence to students who were mostly too young to understand what the words were doing to them. And I had believed, in the half-conscious way of a man whose intellectual life is extensive and whose understanding of his own interior life has always been considerably less so, that I understood what devastation felt like from the inside. I was wrong. What happened to me standing under that oak tree on the evening of my 50th wedding anniversary, while the string quartet inside began the Debussy, while my grandchildren chased each other across the far end of the lawn, while the muffled voices of 200 people who had come to celebrate a marriage drifted through the open French doors, was not like any of the things I had read. It was a sudden removal of floor. It was the discovery, in the middle of a step I had taken 10,000 times, that the ground I was confident about is not, in fact, where I believed it to be. I don't understand, I said. I know you don't, she said. Her voice was steady. Margaret's voice had always been steady, even in moments that would have made other voices crack, and I had loved that about her. Had loved it for 50 years as a quality of her character, of her particular form of strength. Standing under the oak tree, it did not feel like strength. It felt like something else, something for which I did not yet have a name. That's the first thing I need to tell you, but there's something else, James. Something I've been carrying for a very long time, and I don't think there is a right moment for it. And I know this is the wrong one, but I'm running out of moments. She had been ill. I had known and not known simultaneously, in the particular way of a man who is given information and processes it only as far as the place where it would require him to feel something he is not ready to feel. There had been appointments in the last 18 months that she attended alone. There had been a change in her quality of stillness, from the deep, comfortable stillness of a woman who has made peace with most things, to something quieter, something turned further inward, the stillness of someone listening to something only they can hear. I had called it wisdom. I had called it age. I had called it the natural deepening of a person at 71 who has spent a life thinking carefully about the world. I had not called it what it was, because naming it would have required me to look directly at something I had been looking at from the corner of my eye for a year and a half. "How ill?" I said. She looked at me. The light from the house filtered through the oak's full summer leaves, green gold and shifting, and her face in that light was the face I had been looking at for 50 years. The high cheekbones, the gray eyes, the particular way she held her mouth when she was about to say something difficult, which was not tight but very still, as if she were holding herself somewhere behind the words she was choosing, and also in a way that moved through me with the speed and thoroughness of something structural failing, the face of someone I did not know. "That is the second thing," she said. We stayed in the garden for 11 minutes. I know because I looked at my watch when we went back inside. The reflexive check of a man who cannot bear the formlessness of a moment, who reaches for structure when structure has departed. 11 minutes in which she told me enough to rearrange everything and not enough to understand any of it. She told me that she had married me quickly and in grief and not in love. She told me that a man she had loved, whom I knew as a name from the past, Robert Calder, a young man from her university years who had died in a road accident in the autumn of 1972, 3 months before we married, had not, in fact, died. She said those words, "had not died," with the particular care of someone who has rehearsed a sentence many times and is now discovering that rehearsal is not the same as delivery. She told me she had discovered this 6 weeks after our wedding. She told me she had made a choice. She told me she had lived with the choice for 50 years, and that she was sorry, and that she needed to tell me everything, but not here, not tonight, not with 200 people on the other side of the glass. I went back into my anniversary party. I shook hands. I smiled. I gave my speech, which I had memorized, and it came out correctly in every word. And I watched Daniel cry again from the second row of chairs and thought, with the cold detachment of a man who is watching himself from a very great height, what does he know? I cut the cake Margaret had chosen, lemon, because it had been lemon at our wedding, which was a sentimental detail I had found very moving when she mentioned it while planning and now could not look at directly. I danced with her, because we had always danced at parties, and she danced the way she always danced, following easily, one hand in mine, her eyes on my shoulder. And I thought, 50 years of this, 50 years of her eyes on my shoulder, 50 years of the particular warmth of her hand. And I had not known. I had not known the most fundamental thing. This is the thing that I returned to that night, lying awake while Margaret slept beside me, with the even breathing of someone who has, after a very long time, set something down. I was not the wronged party in a drama. I was not the victim of a betrayal of the kind I had read about in the novels I spent my career analyzing. The betrayals of passion and recklessness and selfish desire. I was something stranger. I was a man who had built his entire understanding of his own life on a foundation he had never tested, who had lived for 50 years inside a story that turned out to be a different story than the one he thought he was in. I lay in the dark of our bedroom, the room we had shared for 43 years in this house, with its Victorian ceiling rose and the window that looked onto the back garden and the oak. And I looked at the ceiling and thought about all the things I had believed. I had believed Margaret chose me. I had believed that the speed of our courtship — we met in October of 1972 and married in December, which even at the time people had raised eyebrows about, which Margaret's mother had called precipitous, and which I had called being certain — was an expression of the same certainty I felt. I had believed that what I saw in her face when she said yes was love, and that what I saw in her face across every dinner table and at every children's birthday party and at every conference dinner I dragged her to for 38 years was love, the settled and quieter version, the love that stops announcing itself because it doesn't need to. I had believed this the way you believe in the soundness of a wall, not by testing it, not by pressing your weight against it and assessing whether it holds, but simply by living in the room it encloses and assuming that the fact of its presence is proof enough of its integrity. Margaret was not asleep, I understood eventually. She was lying with her eyes closed, her breathing controlled. Not the breathing of sleep, but the breathing of someone performing sleep, because the alternative is conversation. And she was not ready for conversation. And neither was I. I lay beside her in the practiced arrangement of 50 years. She on the left, me on the right, a pillow each. The gap between us, the gap of two people who have learned to inhabit a shared space without crowding it. And somewhere around 3 a.m, I understood that I was not going to sleep and got up and went downstairs. The kitchen was exactly as the caterers had left it, clean and rearranged, unfamiliar in the way of a room that has been touched by other people's hands and not yet recovered its ordinary character. I made tea I didn't want and stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden, which was dark except for the light from the kitchen falling across the lawn, and at the oak tree at the far end, which was a shape against the lighter darkness of the summer sky. 51 years since I had stood under that tree and asked her to marry me. She had said yes immediately, without hesitation, and I had taken that immediacy as confirmation of the certainty I already felt. I had not wondered what it meant that someone in grief would say yes without hesitation. I had not wondered whether grief, in fact, produces a specific kind of yes, the yes of someone reaching for something solid in the dark, not because the solid thing is what they want most, but because it is what is available. I drank the tea. I went back to bed. I lay beside my wife of 50 years and did not sleep until the birds started. Margaret had a hospital appointment the following Monday. She told me this at breakfast on Sunday, which was the first real conversation we had had since the garden, passing 2 days of careful, ordinary life between us. Meals, the business of thank you notes for anniversary gifts, a phone call from Rose checking that we were all right, which I had answered and Margaret had not joined, sitting at the kitchen table reading the paper with a quality of quiet that I was now reading differently. The appointment was at the cardiac unit of the hospital in the city, 40 minutes drive. She had been seeing a cardiologist, she said, since January. She had not wanted me to worry. "I don't want you to come," she said. She said it with the direct steadiness that had always been Margaret. She had never learned the social grace of softening directness, which I had always found bracing and which our children had found occasionally difficult. "I need to have this appointment without feeling watched." "That's not," I began. "James," she said quietly and folded the newspaper. Her hands on the table were the hands I had been looking at for 50 years, capable hands, the hands of a woman who gardened and cooked and played the piano still, with the knuckles slightly enlarged now from arthritis, the sapphire ring she'd worn since her mother died loose, on the finger that had once held it tight. "I have been managing this alone for long enough that I need to manage it alone a little longer. Not because I don't trust you, because I have things to think through before I can explain them to you." "You've had 50 years to think," I said. I said it without heat, because I didn't have heat yet. What I had was something colder than heat, something more like the careful absence of something. The feeling of a man who is very deliberately not letting himself feel the thing that is waiting. She looked at me. "I know," she said. She went to the appointment alone. I drove to the university library, which I still had access to as an emeritus, and spent 4 hours doing something that was shaped like research, but was actually a form of not being in my own house, which had begun, in the 48 hours since the garden, to feel differently proportioned. Objects that I had lived with for decades. The dresser in the hallway, the painting above the fireplace that Margaret had bought at a country auction the year Daniel started secondary school, the pile of her books on the chair by the bedroom window, had become slightly foreign, slightly legible, in a new way, as if I were reading them for the first time, and finding that the translation was different from the one I had assumed. I found Robert Calder's obituary in the university archive. This was not entirely by plan. I'd gone to the archive to look at something else, or had told myself I had. But once I was there, sitting at the long table in the reading room with the particular smell of old paper that has always been one of the most comforting smells in my life, I found myself typing his name into the catalog search. Robert Calder, born 1949, read Modern Languages, 1968 to 1971. And there it was, a short notice in the University Alumni magazine from the winter issue of 1972, noting the death of Robert Calder in a road traffic accident in October of that year, survived by his parents, expressing the university's condolences. His parents. Not a wife, not children. Just his parents. And underneath the notice, which I had been reading, I saw the notice directly below it in the column. A birth announcement. Robert James Calder, born to Douglas and Edith Calder, October 28, 1973. A son, born a year after the father who supposedly died. I sat with that for some time. The reading room around me was quiet in its institutional way. The occasional rustling of pages, someone at the far end typing. I sat with the magazine open on the table, and the two notices side by side. The death of Robert Calder in October 1972, and the birth of his son in October 1973. And I felt something begin somewhere in my chest that I would not have been able to describe clearly except to say that it was not grief. It was more like the sensation of a door opening in a room that was supposed to be sealed. The sensation of air coming from somewhere. A man who has a son does not have an obituary. A man who has an obituary does not have a son 12 months later. One of these things was false. I knew which one. I drove home. Margaret was back from the hospital, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't drunk, looking at the middle distance in the way she'd been looking at middle distances recently. She looked up when I came in. "How was the library?" she said. "I found Robert Calder's obituary," I said. The cup she'd been holding she set down on the table without a sound, with a deliberateness that told me she'd been holding it very carefully. "James." "And his son's birth announcement?" I said. "Robert James Calder, born October 1973, a year after his father died. I called Daniel that night. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting. 'Dad,' he said. 'Did you know she was going to tell me?' I said. A long pause. 'She told me in April that she was going to tell you before the end of the summer.' His voice had the particular careful quality of someone who has been holding a difficult thing and is not sure whether it is safe to put it down. I told her she needed to. I told her I couldn't. I told her I wouldn't keep it any longer. 'How long have you known?' 'A year and a half,' he said. Robert Calder's solicitor contacted me. There was a small bequest, money, not a lot, and some letters that Robert had asked to be forwarded. Letters Mom had written to him over the years. A pause. I went to Scotland. I went to the solicitor's office and I sat in a room and I read 40 years of my mother's letters to a man I didn't know existed. I closed my eyes. And you didn't come to me. She asked me not to, he said. She said she was going to tell you, that she was finding the moment, that she needed a little more time, and His voice changed. I was angry, Dad. I'm still angry. Not at you, not exactly. At the situation. At the fact that I'm 48 years old and I don't know who my father is, and the person who could tell me doesn't know either. A pause. I had a DNA test done 6 months ago. Privately. Something contracted in my chest. And the silence was exactly long enough to understand the answer before he said it. The result was inconclusive, he said. The Calder family declined to participate, so I know nothing I didn't know before, except that Mom doesn't know. And I don't know. And the man who might have answered the question died in February. I had not thought I could feel worse than I had felt in the garden 2 days ago. I had been wrong about that, as it turned out. Dad, Daniel said, are you all right? The question was absurd in the specific way that appropriate questions become absurd when the situation has outrun the vocabulary available for it. I thought about saying no. I thought about saying, I don't know what all right means at the moment. I said, I need some time. I'll call you tomorrow. I didn't call him tomorrow. I drove to the Wolds instead, east toward the flat land and the wide sky, the particular landscape of this part of the country that I have always found clarifying, the absence of drama in the terrain that creates a corresponding absence of pressure in the mind. I don't know, she said. Margaret was 7 weeks pregnant when we married. I had known this, we had both known. It was part of why December and not a longer engagement, not that I would have wanted a longer engagement. I would have married her the week we met if she'd agreed. Daniel had been born in May, which I had always known and had always matched the arithmetic. What I had not known, what I was now understanding, was the possibility that the arithmetic matched not one father but two. Robert and I, she began. Yes, I said, I understand. I don't know, James. I genuinely don't know. We never tested. I decided when Daniel was born that I would not test, that he was my son, and that was sufficient and that I would... Does Daniel know? I said. Another pause. This one had a different quality. I watched her face, and I read the answer before she said it. He found out, she said. Last year, when Robert died. Robert left him something in his will. I stood very still. Outside the window, the garden was going gold in the evening light, the oak throwing its long shadow across the lawn. My son, or the man I had raised as my son, had known for a year of Sunday phone calls and Christmas visits, and the day Daniel had come to help me move the bookshelves in the study when my back was bad, and we had stood in the study doorway drinking tea and talking about nothing. A year. Get out, I said. She looked at me. I need you to leave this room, I said. My voice was very quiet. I need to be in this room alone, please. She left. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, the particular sound of her step that I would recognize in the dark from 100 other footsteps. The evidence of 50 years in the same house. I sat in the armchair she had vacated and looked at the empty grate and felt something move through me that I still, even now, find difficult to name. It was not rage, though rage was part of it. It was the particular grief of a man who has been loved, genuinely loved. I believe that. I believe it now. In whatever configuration and to whatever degree. She had loved me. The evidence of 50 years is not nothing. But who has been loved in the company of a secret? Who has been the person someone chose while also being the person someone settled for? Who will never know whether the choosing and the settling are as different as he needs them to be. The kitchen was quiet. Margaret was looking at me with an expression I had not seen in 50 years on her face, and I realized that what I was seeing was fear, not the ordinary, manageable fear of embarrassment or conflict, but something deeper. The fear of someone who has been running a calculation for a very long time and has just heard the numbers change. "You went looking," she said. "You didn't give me much choice," I said. I sat down across from her, the table between us, and I looked at her steadily. "He's alive." A pause. "He was alive," she said. "He died in February." Something tightened in my throat. Not grief for Robert Calder, whom I had barely known and had not thought about in decades. Something else. The tightening of someone who is beginning to understand the size of what he doesn't know. "That's why," I said. "That's why now. He died, and I have 18 months, she said. She said it the same way she said most things, levelly, without melodrama. But her hands on the table had curled inward slightly, the knuckles tightening under the skin. The cardiologist today confirmed what we already know. 18 months is likely. Perhaps more with certain interventions. I've decided against the interventions. The room did something. The kitchen, which I have stood in 10,000 mornings, performed some act of spatial reconfiguration that I cannot describe except to say that the distances between things seemed suddenly wrong. I looked at my wife's face. I looked at the cup she wasn't drinking from. I looked at the window with the garden beyond it, and the oak just visible. "Without telling me," I said, "you've been making decisions about whether to live, and you didn't tell me." "James, for how long?" My voice came out very level, which surprised me. "How long have you known?" "Since January," she said, "of last year." 18 months of appointments she attended alone. 18 months of whatever she had been deciding. I stood up from the table, not because I had somewhere to go, but because sitting still had become impossible. And I walked to the window and looked at the garden and put one hand flat on the glass because I needed to feel something solid. And the glass was what was there. "Tell me about Robert," I said. I said it with my back to her, still looking at the garden, and my voice was very quiet. "Tell me everything," she told me in stages, not all at once. That night, and over the following days, in pieces the way you take apart something large by working at its joints. She had loved Robert Calder since their second year at university. He read modern languages, she read history. They had met at a departmental social in October of 1970 and had been together from that point forward, the particular total absorption of young people who have found each other before they've fully formed and find themselves forming around the finding. When she described him, she used words she had never used about anything in my hearing. Incandescent was one. Overwhelming was another. I am not a jealous man by nature, and I had not known I had this capacity until I heard my wife describe the love of her life and understood that I was not it.